What's worse, when something is just outright bad, or when it's almost good? To me, when something is almost good, it lingers on the edge of my mind for a lot longer than something that's just bad.
Bullshit, I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
I end up rotating it and its specific failures and digging into it and trying to pick and pull apart what exactly went wrong. Of course, almost good is subjective, something that may stick out to me or another person may not for someone else. When something is bad, its negative traits tend to be more explicit. They can be more agreed upon. This is to say, Shadow of the Erdtree came out, and I've been thinking about it all the time. To preface, I like Elden Ring. I like Elden Ring a lot. I also like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but Elden Ring got to me in a very particular way. This isn't to say that Elden Ring is better than those games, but Elden Ring did something that they didn't narratively that captured my attention, that unfortunately Shadow of the Erdtree's failures ended up highlighting. FromSoft is very good at telling you one thing and showing you another. The narrative irony is often used to highlight a game's given themes.
Beast! Oh, foul beast!
So when Shadow of the Erdtree keeps telling you how tragic Miquella is and how bad you should feel for him, and then has him be almost cartoonishly evil, it feels baffling. Like, to explain what I mean, Miquella abandons the Haligtree and all the people who believed in him, while also tricking at least some of his faithful into thinking he'd been kidnapped, abandons his sister once she was no longer useful to him, sent said sister after their half-brother when he would not marry Miquella, the result of which was Caelid getting space cancer. Side note to that, this is not necessarily Miquella's direct fault per se, but if Miquella can cure the rot given the ability of the Needle Knight's sword, among other things in the DLC, then this implies something kind of fucked up about his and Malenia's relationship. Miquella also charms Mohg into being evil so that he'd get murdered. This is all stuff Miquella does before abandoning love for godhood, by the way. He then uses Mohg's body, after coercing his murder, as a vessel for Radahn's soul, almost certainly against Radahn's wishes, and, Miquella psychically forces people to follow him and his will for much of the DLC. And much of this is framed as Miquella being naive, somehow? Okay, to frame this, let's compare to the base game. Base game Miquella's vision is flawed. We understand this virtue of the fact his grand plans involve just making a cooler Erdtree. Said cooler Erdtree still segregates its denizens by proximity to humanity, with Albinaurics and Misbegotten on the outside. Granted, we do see cocoons of first-generation Albinaurics in Elphael proper. The fact that we see no second-generation Albinaurics inside the Haligtree, instead stuck in the consecrated snowfield, still speaks to a level of segregation. The idea of unalloyed gold itself speaks to Miquella not seeing the Golden Order as necessarily inherently flawed per se, just in need of refinement. This is all interesting, and again, says a lot about Miquella despite us not interacting with him directly ever. It speaks to a certain level of I-can-fix-itness, some arrogance behind genuinely good intentions. The DLC has some interesting ideas regarding this. One of the strongest elements is how Miquella self-martyrs in an attempt to become a better god than Marika, while very clearly making the exact same mistakes she did. There is something tangible there, but it's undermined by everything else. We know Miquella harbors doubts about what he's doing, given that he very literally severs both doubt as well as love around the same time. These actions imply a certain level of remorse or regret. However, he cannot both doubt what he's doing, feel bad for hurting others, and also be naive and not understand fully what he's doing. If he's a zealot firmly rooted to doing what he thinks is right, to the great detriment of others as well as himself, that's one thing. That's even something potentially interesting. But again, when the DLC repeatedly goes, don't you feel bad for him? He's in so much pain. While cutting such a wide path of destruction just feels bizarre, which is further burdened by his apparent motivation or lack thereof. But going back to his actions themselves, in Dark Souls 1, Gwyn is tragic, yeah. He can ultimately be seen as an old man, afraid of the dark, afraid of change, but he and the empire of the gods he built was often cruel and inherently unjust. Despite being somewhat ominous, the various ages of dark portrayed throughout the series at least escape the stagnancy of Gwyn's Age of Fire. Killing Gwyn paves the path forward for humanity. It's uncertain, but that's not a bad thing. Somewhat similarly, Laurence is very much a villain's person and can be interpreted as the closest thing to an explicit villain Bloodborne gets outside, like, the specter of violence against women. The Healing Church experiments on people in search of eldritch truths, and when there's consequences to this cosmic meddling in the form of beast plague, Laurence has Old Yharnam burned. However, Laurence has sort of had his narrative comeuppance in The Hunter's Nightmare, being set on fire permanently and longing for a humanity he can never have back due to his arrogance and cruelty. Killing Laurence is a warranted mercy. He, like everyone else in the DLC, do not deserve to be tortured forever. Given this precedent, you'd think Miquella would have something similar go on. But Mesmer's way closer to this, except I don't care about Mesmer all that much, really. Sorry. But the problem comes back to the game telling us to feel bad for Miquella, telling us that he has good intentions, but he's misguided, but only ever showing us the outcome of his actions. Like, okay, cheesy example, if in the original Star Wars, if Darth Vader never sacrificed himself for Luke, and we were only ever told by Luke that there was still good in Vader, but never actually saw it on screen, the audience might be left thinking that Luke was an idiot. And going back to the DLC itself, we are supposed to parallel Marika's path to godhood with Miquella's, starting with perhaps wishing to build a kinder world than the one she was brought into, where people are turned into horrifying meat blobs in jars, but ultimately becoming a monster due to the inherent nature of the absolute power of godhood. She recreated the exact evils done to her. But Miquella is not a victim of the world that Marika built. In the base game, his and Malenia's curses are emphasized, but in the DLC, Miquella very easily abandons his cursed body, and it's not inconvenient becoming incorporeal and no doubt painful, but it doesn't appear to be any more so than his child's body. His original curse was frailty, but that really didn't seem to matter because his charm ability instantly melts the resolve of anyone who opposed him. He is consistently framed as being terrifying from day one. The incorporeality isn't even related to shedding his cursed flesh, it's in pursuit of becoming a good god, e.g., not personally responsible for hurting others and instead using Radahn as a medium for it. In comparison, Marika rips godhood out of a mass of corpses, bloody and defiant. It was not something foisted upon her by the greater will, she wanted it. Miquella, meanwhile, apparently mostly just feels compelled as an Empyrean if the memory we get is anything. It's almost a matter of inevitability, which, okay, but we know about Ranni. Ranni is desperate to escape godhood and the Two Fingers, going so far as to steal the Rune of Death to destroy her Empyrean flesh. In the DLC, Miquella abandons his flesh and becomes a god anyway, I've seen no one mention this, and I'm still hung up because this seems like a huge contradiction of everything we know about from the base game. I'm also confused because we literally see his body in the base game, not pieces of it being shed. It's in the cocoon, we can see it. But that's a whole other thing. So, Ranni goes to extreme lengths to escape her fate because in part she correctly sees gods and godhood as an overall negative for the lands between. Even if doing so is at great personal cost and has huge consequences in the form of Godwin's not death. Whereas Nicola apparently embraces it and wants to use his godhood to make the world good TM. This might be an intriguing dichotomy, but given its framing in the narrative, it's very hard for me to be persuaded by a character feeling compelled to do something terrible when I am presented with examples of characters in the same situation not doing that. Melania only embraces her curse and becomes the rock goddess in a desperate bid during her boss fight, very much like her fight with Radon. Marika becomes a god because she wants to. Ranni deliberately avoids godhood out of compassion for the world. Nicola, by comparison, going, oh, woe is me, I must do all these terrible things for godhood that I'm cosmically mandated for, just is not thematically compelling to me. It cheapens any desperation he apparently has to build a better world via godhood if he merely feels compelled to do so by birthright. Ranni's desperation is also undercut by Nicola's narrative. Oh, so to avoid godhood you just had to not go to the Lanes of Shadow and walk through a big door? Then she didn't need to inadvertently get Godwin half-murdered and thereby cause the Shattering, a war that destroyed the lands between. Like, some of this is just also the result of the rules, quote-unquote, of Empyreanness being undercut. You know, Ranni's desperation to escape the Two Fingers makes a lot more sense when they are literally sending assassins after you and her, whereas Nicola does not mention the Two Fingers at all. Speaking of undercutting, the DLC undercuts so much of the base game, it's honestly astounding. It's hard for me to know where to start exactly, so I'm just gonna start with Mohg. In the base game, Mohg is a fascinating villain among the demigods. Godric and Rykard are evil, but there's something stand out to Mohg in particular. Mohg replaces the austere and thinly veiled evil of the Golden Order and its dogmatists with outright violence and terror, emphasizing how a society's ills can compound. He embraces the defilement, quote-unquote, of his cursed own blood to the point where he lets a horn blind him. He seeks to share this gift with others via indoctrination and kidnapping. He very much is the platonic ideal of a cult leader. He promises love when he could not care less about even his most devoted followers. We also get a glimpse into his psyche through his actions. One might surmise a connection between desiring uncomplicated love through cultic devotion and being thrown into a sewer as baby. Mohg is evil, but much like Dark Souls 3's Aldrich, he has somewhat correctly seen a flaw in the world and seeks to establish his own dynasty in place of it. Like Aldrich, however, he is an evil maniac who does so not out of a desire for justice, but for power. It makes him a very compelling villain. It also fills out the tapestry of the demigods, serving potentially as a pinnacle of their worst traits. And then the DLC's like, no, actually he was okay until Nicola made him evil. It's just mind-boggling. Especially when base game Mohg's story parallels Marika's in the DLC in a way that's almost better than Nicola's does. Mohg's character is no longer partly a result of the world Marika made, where it was acceptable and even necessary for the goddess of the land to throw her children into a sewer, but just like Nicola being manipulative. And I have seen arguments to the effect that Ansbach could be unreliable, Shrive just means free from guilt. Mohg could have already had negative traits that Nicola just exacerbates. That is not in the game. Ansbach specifically is continually framed as the voice of reason and is never contradicted by another reliable NPC. Typically, unreliable narrators or liars in FromSoft games will have some level of exposition. Even charitably, Mohg not being exceptionally evil among the demigods and then being manipulated and used, inflicting so much terror onto others, due even just partly from influence on Mikló's part, and not the outcome of his own character, wildly weakens everything about him and his actions thematically. It's just asinine. Not only that, but it also undercuts the tragedy and irony of Mohg's kidnapping of Mikló. We don't know because it's conspicuously absent, but we can maybe assume that even Mikló's flawed vision for a new world did not involve maiming and enslaving Omen. And because of Mohg's disfigurement of the cocoon, Mikló is trapped in a suspended animation, therefore not only foiling all of Mikló's grand plans and strangling them in their crib, but Mikló can never give Mohg what he wants. Much like how Mohg ignores the sincere prayers of Vare, Mikló ignores Mohg. The consequences of Mikló's abduction also gets undercut by the DLC. In the base game, we don't know explicitly why Radahn and Malenia fight. It feels very intentional as a point of speculation for the player. Malenia could be interpreted as assuming Radahn was a threat to the order that she and Mikló were trying to build, and she'd potentially be correct to do so given Radahn's veneration of Godfrey, as well as his strength in almost taking Leyndell. You could also interpret it as being a response to Mikló's abduction, given the placement of Mikló's cocoon and the layout of Caelid. Or you could also see the entire element as being tragic, given that Mikló may have only been abducted because Malenia was absent. But regardless of all of this, or any other interpretation that we may have had, the outcome is the same. Whatever they were fighting for, they both lost. Radahn's immense strength, all of his warriors, all of that becomes inconsequential when a mind-destroying plague turns him into a zombie. But despite everything, his men carry on in his absence, fighting the Scarlet Rot and attempting to fulfill his final wish for a good death. They also hang corpses in effigy and potentially burn plague victims alive. It paints a picture of a somewhat complicated man with some good qualities undone by the very thing he loved most, which was war. Meanwhile, without Mikló, Malenia is listless and unable to lead the Erdtree soldiers to fulfill his vision for a better world. And instead, without Mikló to counteract the rot, the Erdtree begins to wither and die. She and her soldiers just sit and wait and hope he'll come back. Their devotion was to Mikló as opposed to his ideals, and that ends up being their undoing. These things, among others, come to say something about Radahn and Malenia as both leaders and as people, and it also ends up being a poignant encapsulation of the Shattering as a pointless, terrible war fed by the demigods' unfettered power and ambition. We don't know why, because it wasn't important enough. And again, this is thrown out the window for a DLC story that's so much weaker by comparison. Malenia is now sicked like a dog on Radahn, dooming Caelid so their brother can become a god, even though he never cures her rot. The whole thing established in their dynamic in the base game, the foundation of Mikló's creation of the unalloyed gold needle, the encapsulation of his belief that he can fix the Golden Order, not unlike how he repairs Malenia's rot-stricken body, is refuted, just like the importance of the relationship. In that way, the unalloyed gold needle instead just becomes a means to ensure Malenia lived long enough to fight Radahn, apparently. It's left snapped in half because Mikló had no use for her anymore. The potential toxic codependency of twins is turned instead to Mikló using her sister her entire life, abandoning her, all while we are told how kind Mikló is. On the subject of Radahn, I am also baffled by the DLC's choices surrounding his character. I will admit I am biased as someone who went insane trying to piece together his motivations for the past 2 years and writing far too much about it. But during that time, I came to the conclusion that the explicit point of the lack of his motivations spoke to a sort of glory-seeking that is why, while he had some apparently good personal qualities, also made him a warlord. His admiration of Godfrey, who served America in her imperial crusades, in combination with his attempts to take Leyndell, for reasons not known to the player, lead one to at least a few conclusions. One can surmise either A, he was trying to help Rykard, whose War in the Shattering was considered one of, if not the worst. B, he was conquering for conquering's sake, morally vacant and yet abhorrent, and or something to do with Godfrey. Or C, all of the above. It says something about him, not all good necessarily. It's important to remember Rykard's men also loved him before he fed himself to a snake. So loyalty and adoration are not necessarily a good soul indicator that someone is a good person in Elden Ring's world. These are all things sort of faintly alluded to in the base game that actually could have been interesting to get into more with the DLC, as opposed to what we got. What we got was, yeah, so as kids, he and Miquella made a vow that Radahn would become his consort so that Miquella could ascend to godhood and establish the Kindness Brigade. Like, huh? Nowhere in the base game does Radahn at any point seem to especially care about being kind or helping the oppressed. There are certain elements that indicate he might not have sucked as much as someone like Godric. You know, Radahn's trolls aren't stabbed for cart pulling, and he apparently has a Crucible Knight and a Leonine Vespasian as loyal soldiers, which maybe says something about a relative tolerance that he has. But again, by no means does that make him a good person in pursuit of justice. We're never given any evidence of that. Especially because he seems to be shown holding some relationship with Rykard, and Rykard is extremely awful to the Albinaurics. And this goes without saying, but again, if we're to believe that Mohg was not at fault for any of the evils he committed because Miquella forced him to with mind control powers, then we can't believe anything about Radahn and Miquella's relationship was consensual. Not that any incestuous relationship can be, but Miquella's mind control powers add a whole other layer of coercion. I've seen people argue that Miquella's charm ability isn't really mind control, but everything about the game's framing makes it seem almost exactly like mind control. Like, just for example, because this is the most direct evidence, the mechanic in Miquella's boss fight is that if you fail to use the Broken Great Rune after getting grabbed twice, your character does not nod and go, "You know what, Miquella, you have a point. I will lay down and die now." Your character kneels on the ground, puts their hand over their heart as though love-struck, and reaches out to Miquella in awe. And then you die to a heart-stolen message. Steal in this context does not indicate something, innocent. Delving into the coercion aspect of Miquella's charm ability, the varying interpretations I've seen regarding Radahn's willingness or lack thereof in Miquella's plans confirms to me a messiness that leads to things. Things that at best are unintentional and at worst outright pernicious, especially given how victimhood is treated vis-a-vis Miquella secretly being in control the whole time regarding his kidnapping. Freya says that Radahn would want to be brought back from the dead as an action figure, and there's little direct evidence to contradict. Ansbach implies Freya may be misguided, but when it's time to fight Consort Radahn, Ansbach does not seem particularly apologetic or otherwise acknowledge that Radahn may be unwilling. Additionally, the visual language of Consort Radahn does little to indicate either case as well. He's cool, heroic, almost awe-inspiring, especially when Miquella goes into backpack mode. He's often likened to being at the height of his power again. But he never speaks, almost as if he's unable to. We understand he almost certainly reneged on his promise he made to Miquella, given Miquella had to send Malenia to go kill him, and the fact that following that, Radahn refused to die. But we never hear from Radahn directly. We are told about what Radahn would want from other characters. There's never any significant dialogue from the man himself, even in an item description. There's also the visual resemblance between Radahn and Leonard and the Putrescent Knight. The knight fights on St. Trina's behalf because it desires peace, but given its development history, the similarities are likely unintentional. I find it troubling for a few reasons. Like, let's say that Radahn is 100% unwilling, which I believe we are supposed to think given that action figure Radahn is so vacant that even his theme gets warped by Miquella's all-encompassing light. However, given how many people I have seen argue against this, that Radahn must be willing or was at some point, there is a level of ambiguity here that is no longer intentional, I think. But in addition, if he is unwilling, then Radahn is stripped of all agency and is just a tool, with no ambition, no regard for the Shattering's plot, really. If he is willing, then that is just a whole mess, because now Radahn has a huge, pointless, terrible war with Malenia that destroys Caelid for no apparent reason. Not only that, but when a character's victimhood comes first and foremost, their role solely in an abuser's story, highlighted to the detriment of their own character and agency, it's gross. It is possible to be both a victim and a complicated person, even a victim with agency despite where it's damaged by an abuser, and that should be reflected in fiction. Because when the sole purpose of a victim in fiction is as a vessel for the abuser's characterization, that's just very disappointing. Mohg and Radahn in this way kind of end up almost being victimized twice. Once by the narrative, literally, where Miquella takes their free will away, but the second time where anything about them as people, characters, their ambitions and motivations, all of it gets thrown out in service of elevating Miquella's story. It's gross, and I don't like it. Regarding Consort Radahn and the visual language is that if it's supposed to convey an evil done to, if nothing else, at least to Mohg, it fails. If we didn't see Ludwig go from horrific beast to clinging to his last shred of humanity, and we just had some guy, that'd communicate nothing. If Artorias was not revealed to have failed in stopping the Abyss, and failed badly, we could not dispel the notion that the Age of the Gods was not already flawed before the fire faded. It'd be stupid. Like, where is my body horror from, Soft? They made Mohg, this Mohg, into a bracelet! Okay, aside over, moving on. If there was something to tie this to my other somewhat minor issues compared to all that with the DLC, I find it missed a large opportunity to expound upon the relationships between the demigods we already had without shoehorning in a bunch of new, secret guys who totally existed in the lore, we swear. What made Elden Ring stand out from past FromSoft games for me was that intricate familial connection with its doors left open for a lot of interesting interpretations. Anything teased about Goodwin, especially his potential relationship with Malenia and Miquella. Here's some catacombs with some lightning skeletons in. Does Messmer have any relationship with any of his various siblings and half-siblings? No. R'hllana ditches her sister with some knights to go on a genocidal crusade, and Bernal is just kind of okay with it. Kindly Miquella doesn't even directly or indirectly ask you to kill Mr. Genocide Messmer, you just do, so you can burn the sealing tree so you can go kill Miquella. Like, okay, R'hllana's undying devotion to Messmer is almost interesting, but there's not enough time to make the connections particularly deep or meaningful. There's some carrion stuff in the Shaded Castle, and Messmer soldiers in Castle Ensis, but that's not a lot to go off of. Like, why does she care about him so much? Who's to say? Likewise, why is Gaius, an Albanuric, not only permitted to fight for Mesmer's cause, but also gets up to the rank of commander? He is literally of a group of people the Erdtree despises, shorn of the Erdtree's light. Like, that's almost interesting as well, but Gaius is present for all of 5 minutes. This was potentially maybe in service of some kind of similarity between Mesmer and Miquella, getting would-be enemies into their fold with charisma or leadership, but there's not enough there to be impactful if that's the case. Mesmer calls you a bitch and dies. His Fire Knight followers have much more interest to me in that many of them have differing ideas about the course of the crusade, some of whom outright express doubt. Standing in contrast from the base game is Morgott. Morgott is a tragic antagonist with mom issues that works for me. Firstly, he has an iconic opening. He pops out of nowhere twice to try and kill you. His devotion to an order that shunned and despises him, his own deep self-hatred due to that, the fact he is the only demigod to defend Leyndell and the Erdtree, comes together to paint a very compelling character. Like this moment in the base game.
What is thy business with these thrones? General Radahn? Praetor Rykard?
The venom in Morgott's voice when he mentions Rykard, despite literally fighting Radahn personally in Mortal Kombat, says so much about Morgott as a character, as well as Rykard. And this whole scene is also interesting because Morgott does not mention Moog whatsoever. By comparison, Mesmer is just another cursed child of Marika, who was eventually abandoned despite Marika potentially caring about him deeply at one point, who becomes a monster on said mother's behalf. He has complicated feelings about his abandonment that he seems to struggle with, and it's not interesting, but it's too short-lived and ends up falling flat. He didn't even pop out of a trash can to call us a bitch. I've spent a long time complaining, and there's more I could complain about, but I'm gonna end it here because I want to emphasize I'm complaining not because I hated the DLC in its entirety, but because I can see a better version of it in my head, and the parts of it I do enjoy end up getting overshadowed by the stuff I don't enjoy. You know, there's a lot of fun gameplay stuff, but I don't want to go back to fight Rolana because it feels like such a nothing burger of a fight. You know, I find Marika's story about the inherent nature of godhood being that there's no good gods because power like that is corrupting and also attracts people with flawed views of the world. It's very interesting, but whenever I go to the Shaman village, I just am sad that this element isn't in a better story. The followers of Miquella are all extremely interesting and compelling characters, and the unique interactions you can have with them are deeply compelling, but it's hard to really love them when their stories end up undermining another story that I like so much more. You know, I like Leda, in particular as someone is driven to terrible violence through her extreme devotion. That's interesting. But it ends up feeling kind of half-baked, because Miquella just kind of sucks. Ultimately, it just ends up feeling at odds with itself and the game it's supposedly an add-on for. That all being said, if there was one thing I enjoyed unabashedly, it was this.
Curse you, Bale! Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide with a hail of harpoons with every last drop of my being!
I'm sure there will be a few comments to the effect of, clearly you didn't read the item description for the Trousers of Malediction to understand the deep lore, and I'd reply with, yeah, sure, okay. But I will also say that it is a flaw of FromSoft's writing if, at times, it can be really easy to miss apparently important lore if it's on an item with a 2% drop rate in an optional area. To draw us back, part of why Shadow of the Erdtree has stuck in my brain so long, even as I try to slowly extricate myself from being mad about video games all the time, is because there's a version of it that's better somewhere, just not here, and that hurts. Elden Ring ends on a weird wet fart where we kill Mikola the backpack, and then see how he wanted a better world. What attracted me to FromSoft games was that FromSoft does something really unique with its ability to allow for ambiguity, allow for a little squishiness with its world building, but also that it leverages its game mechanics to tell a story. It'd be difficult to replicate the experience of, let's say, idly checking the item that increases your memory slots and realizing, oh my god, it's pieces of Noxtella's Black Moon, in a book or a movie, you know? I trust FromSoft to tell good stories in their games, and that's why I was so disappointed. I didn't mash my face against the brick wall of Dark Souls 1 because I just like how the brick tastes. I wanted to know about the world, too. You can't love art deeply and not also be unable to be hurt or disappointed by it. You know, initially after beating the final DLC boss for the first time, I was really crushed and upset because while I knew what I had hoped for was not going to be what I got, what we did get felt something like a slap in the face. But if there's some positive to take away from this, I think like all almost good art, I will take my issues with it and try to apply the lessons from it to my own work. Ultimately, I will almost certainly play the next FromSoft game and be insane about the lore of it, but I will be more willing to regard its flaws and potentially more hesitant to involve myself as deeply. One final thing I wanted to leave off on was a thank you to everyone who posted gameplay footage on YouTube. I would have had to replay the entirety of Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne for like 10 seconds of footage collectively, so that saved me a lot of time. I also wanted to specifically thank Zullie the Witch and BonfireVN for allowing me to use their Elden Ring video footage. They had stuff I just would not have been able to get on my own, so thank you to them specifically. I'd also like to thank my Discord friend for allowing me to duel them so I could get footage of Elphael without aggroing every single enemy. So yeah, and I also want to thank you, the viewer, for watching this video in its entirety. This video was very much a labor of love. I've never made anything like this, and I don't know if I'll make anything like it again, but in either case, I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you have a nice day.